you go into the history and you look at the history of bubbles, housing is a scam. The 1997 Asian financial crisis was driven by property speculation. 1989 Japanese real estate bubble, again, property speculation.
Okay, so you say money is broken.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
Why is it that housing is what everyone is obsessed by in this country? What makes that so?
What is Bitcoin?
Something else that I think we really need to be aware of is the development of CBDCs. And this is something the Reserve Bank of New Zealand is working on. They're calling it digital cash.
What are you going to do if all of this is just a giant bubble and it all goes to zero?
I'll be buying it all the way down.
Today we're speaking to Cody Ellingham, who I would explain as being one of the biggest lovers of Bitcoin that I've come across out of New Zealand. So I think today we're going to talk a lot about Bitcoin and we'll get to quiz you on that. But do you want to start with your background and we'll then dig in and see where it takes us?
Yeah, sure, man. I'm Cody Ellingham. I host my own podcast, The Transformation of Value, which is really exploring these bigger ideas of freedom, Bitcoin, and creativity. And I grew up in Hawke's Bay, spent the first couple of decades of my life there. And in a funny series of events, I found myself in Japan about 2013. So I was stuck in Hastings, of all places, cleaning office buildings. And I was just out of high school, not sure what to do with my life. And I was on Karumu Road vacuuming the Smith & Smith auto glass repair place late at night with the vacuum on my back. And there was just something about the drone of the vacuum cleaner, this kind of zen-like noise. And this voice spoke to me and it was like, get to Japan. And I don't know where it came from, man. It was this prophetic thing. And that just set off this course of events that changed my life. Ended up getting my act together, getting university entrance, getting some money together, getting some scholarships, going down to Vic to study, getting over to Japan, getting some scholarships to do that. And a few things happened and it all, led to where I am today. Little old Hastings through to Tokyo, which is like 20, 30 million people, depending on the day.
Yeah. Before we continue on with that, are you a religious person at this stage? Or so when you say like prophetic, like a voice talk to you, you listen to headphones, you listen to some motivational content, like what was?
Well, we might get to that. Okay. I mean, at the time, I would say it was listening to your gut is maybe another way of putting it.
Okay.
But we'll get to that, the voice.
Yeah.
But, it was an incredible journey. And it was sort of this idea of like the gravitational pull of Hawke's Bay, man. I don't know. You're
from Dannyville, mate, down the road.
That's my ancestors, man. Like, people who know that it holds you in. There's something about the ranges that just sort of keep you in Hawke's Bay. So it was just to get out was like a major move, and to get all the way, to Asia was pretty awesome. But
had any of your family been to Asia before, or Japan, or?
My grandfather, I love him, but he's never even been to the South Island, man.
Oh.
So it's sort of like that's the story, and I think this is something you'll probably relate to, Luke. Is like New Zealand. It's sort of we're at the bottom of the world. We can often get stuck in this place and we think that the world's this place out there, but we got to go to it, you know? So that was like the journey. And then along the way, you meet people that sort of help you out with that journey. And I think maybe it's something we can talk about. But once you have that vision, once you have the mission, the people that you need to meet come into your life, which is pretty awesome. Did that, ended up in Japan. And then through another series of events, ended up back in New Zealand, which is where I got into the Bitcoin stuff. So that was really trying to understand like what had actually happened. We had all this like money printing that happened during the COVID years, all this inflation, why are houses $1 million a pop? And it started this journey for me to understand the nature of money, which we can also talk about. That's where Bitcoin happened. And then along the way, I was always doing creative stuff. I've always worked for myself, doing design, photography, that sort of thing. And those two worlds sort of came together. And that's where I'm at now, doing the podcast and helping with creative stuff. Yeah.
Nice. All right. Well, we'll work through some of those pieces.
Yeah, sure.
So you're like average student at school, or you're like you don't really enjoy it?
In high school?
Yeah.
I was a bit of an underachiever.
Yeah.
I was doing my own thing. And that was kind of just, I guess, the New Zealand school system, public school system, you got NCEA, but it's not really that much of a push to try too hard. And it's kind of, I was lucky in a sense because I had to go and get university entrance after finishing school. I didn't quite do it properly, so that was a little bit of a thing. But I was always interested in my own study though. So school is not really learning, in my opinion. It's sort of just the place you go. but actually I've always been interested in my own thing. I was into computers, into art, that sort of thing, which was always self-directed learning. So there's a big difference there, I think, with,
So then you go to uni, and what do you study at uni? And how do you get a scholarship?
Yeah, so I did Japanese and media studies.
At
Vic.
uni?
At Vic, yeah.
Gotcha.
And I got a scholarship through the Dominion Post to go over to do an exchange for a year in Japan at a university there. And there was also some other support available through the Vic OE program that they had at the time, which was really awesome. And that made a big difference. And then when I arrived in Japan, I found out that the Japanese government also wanted to give me some money. So I was like, okay, I'll take it. Thank you very much.
Why do they want to give you money?
They had a program for students who had, I think I wrote an essay and they saw it, and they got a program for supporting overseas students.
Gotcha.
So that was really awesome. And so, had the time of my life for a year, was on this study program, but it was kind of like more of a lifestyle thing, because you do a couple of classes a week, but I had like a part-time job.
Yeah, what were you working in?
I worked at a place called Uniqlo, which is like kind of like a fashion
clothing?
place. Clothing.
Is it massive? Yeah.
I came from Japan. It's huge. Okay. So, I mean, that was like my part-time job in Japan, and I was living in Tokyo. It was like mega city. And again, compared to Hastings, man.
Yeah, big fright.
Have you been to Japan?
No, I haven't. Yeah.
It's the first time you see the city that stretches beyond the horizon, and it's kind of like Auckland times like 10 or 20, It's just such a huge place. It was mind-blowing, and that was like a huge creative inspiration, that there's this whole world out there of places and opportunity floating around. And that's just the beginning, because I ended up spending a bit of time in other parts of Asia, traveling around and seeing that there's a whole world out there of opportunity, So.
Yeah, it is always good to get out of the bubble of New Zealand and see so much stuff that's so much bigger as well. You're like, wow, what is this?
Yeah, and it's funny, man, that you're from Dannevirke, man, because I mean, my parents live in my Pukeroa now, and it's like, man, it's unchanging. I was just back there a couple of weeks ago, and it really doesn't change whatsoever. You know, it's the same rivers, the same mountains, and there's something beautiful about that, and it's kind of, I get quite nostalgic about that. I don't know about you, but it is kind of quite quaint and beautiful in its own way.
Back in Palmy recently, and what I did enjoy about it is that you can get anywhere in the city in about 10 minutes. But I remember, driving on the southern motorway into work here, and sometimes it'll take an hour 40, and just seeing how people are starting their day angry or upset or frustrated. You're in the dark. And that was a little bit of motivation for me to ensure that I kept going with the things that I was doing, because I wanted to eventually be able to afford rent, to then not have to spend the time doing that commute, or just not be doing a job or something in my life where that was the energy that I was bringing to the start of my day.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because I think there's something about the nature of cities, and then in a deeper way, the nature of money, that really speaks to what you just said, and this way that Auckland in particular has become this real rat race of property, of speculation. For me, that's really fascinating. And as I've gone down the Bitcoin rabbit hole, I've begun to understand just how manufactured that whole arrangement is. Like, why is it that housing is what everyone is obsessed by in this country? Like, what makes that so? And I think when you start asking those questions, you start to see actually the challenges with money and why it is broken in a way, and how something like Bitcoin really presents an opportunity for a new way of doing things.
Well, let's stay there then, and then we can go back to some of the other chapters of your life just to make sense of it all. But why is it that you think that property is the thing, and we're so obsessed by, and there's constantly articles every week, and even if, when people talk about not being able to get ahead in New Zealand and they leave for Australia, when you ask them what is it that you're trying to achieve, it's normally home ownership. So when you say it's manufactured to be like that, what have you learned, or what have you unpacked?
Well, I think at a basic level, New Zealanders are very practical people, and that's something I'm very proud of. But there's something about houses that is very tangible. And unlike the US or other markets where you have more developed equities markets and stock markets and things, for New Zealanders, housing is where it's at. And it just so happens that means you have this so-called wealth effect. The government is able to lean into that and sort of, it sort of goes on both sides, but it generally wants homeowners to maintain that wealth effect. There's a whole lot of incentives for that system to keep going around, to keep the money go round happening. And as you say, that means people get priced out, and you get young people who can't get on the so-called ladder. But it is a manufactured ladder, and then you've got regulations around housing and zoning and all this stuff as well. That means it shouldn't be an issue. And I contrast this with the experience in Japan, where housing is a commodity. You don't invest in housing in Japan. I mean, there are corporate-owned rental properties and things, but they're a service. They're a affordable thing. And, I don't worry about trying to buy a house in Japan. I don't think that's like the market's going to get away on me. And it's been flat like that for a long time. But New Zealand still has this kind of fetish for housing, and you see it even in media, shows like The Block or whatever. People watch these TV shows, they want to do the DIY, they get it into their mind that that's the only way to get ahead. And that's at the expense of maybe doing something else. And so I think there's some real issues there.
What do you think then about KiwiSaver being allowed to be used to access it for your first home?
I think that they kind of had to do that maybe. I mean, KiwiSaver is a relatively new system, and it's unfortunate that it took so long, because I know Australia had a similar system for much longer, and so that arguably that's why Australia is a much wealthier country than New Zealand. But I mean, yeah, sure, you should be able to use it, but the fact is the way people are obsessed by this, and they forfeit maybe some of the best years of their life slaving away to try and get that deposit together, when actually if they had gone off and done what they really needed to do, maybe they would come back with a much better chance to be able to get into housing in the first place. So it kind of is almost like its own kind of brain drain when people are just focused on the house and not building actual businesses.
Do you think your time in Japan opened your eyes to this? Because to me it seems like you're a creative guy, not a finance guy, and then something along your journey has piqued your interest in what the fuck is happening with money.
Yeah, and that really, as I said, came back to the COVID years, and I was like, wait, we can just have this money get printed by the government to pay for this lockdown, which may or may not have been necessary. And it's like, okay, that's really interesting, because I'm selling my time for dollars that they can print. And then, the governor can come out and say, oh, we're just going to change the interest rates, or we're just going to move this or that. And it's like, well, who gave you that authority? Like, you're not even voted, bro. Like, you're just an independent thing. Like, I don't know, it just felt really strange. And then I went down the rabbit hole of like, well, where does the money come from? Because in New Zealand, it's fiat money. It's not backed by anything.
Yeah.
People think maybe there's gold or something behind it. No, it's all just paper all the way down. And that's when you start saying, well, actually, there's been this issue for a long time. And then Bitcoin came along, and it was like, okay, we're going to make money that the government can't control. We're going to make money that's maybe a little bit more like the olden days where you had a real commodity backing it. And it's been pretty incredible to see what's happened in the last 16 years with Bitcoin.
Did you find Bitcoin before you understood all of this, or did you find the problem and then think that Bitcoin was the solution?
I think I had been feeling kind of creatively, I get these like spider senses, and going to Japan in their first place was like, this kind of voice, right? And I had been interested in what's called Austrian economics for a while, which is kind of theories on how money works. And that was really fascinating. And Bitcoin didn't come along until a bit later. I had sort of heard about it, as many people do, but it really only clicked with my return to New Zealand and the COVID era, and saying, okay, I started sort of just reading a few things. And I don't know the exact moment when it happened. Excuse me. I don't know the exact moment when it happened, but just realizing that there was a fixed supply of this thing. They can't print it. They can't control it. There's always going to be more money they can print with New Zealand dollars or US dollars. And it's just, if you do, I'm a simple man, but I think, man, would I rather have the thing that's a fixed supply or the thing that has an infinite supply? Give me the fixed one any day of the week. And yeah, I just began looking into that. And I see now more and more that it is a solution for this problem.
I think sometimes Mikey says that Bitcoiners understand that the problem is money and that Bitcoin is the solution.
Yeah.
Non-Bitcoiners understand there's a problem but see property as a solution. Something like, I've completely butchered that. But you could argue that that's subconsciously what Kiwi people are trying to do anyway, because they probably don't go down the depth of understanding of money that you've done, but know something's broken and it gets drilled into them. Like, the faster you're on the ladder, the better. You need to buy a property. Where else are you going to live? You're wasting your money paying rent. At least you get something at the end of it, and property's scarce, land's scarce. So some of the same principles. Yeah,
so there's a couple of things there though. So you get something at the end of it. I mean, man, my family went through the Cyclone Gabrielle. I have friends in Christchurch, had friends in Japan in 2011. They had the big earthquake. Man, you don't own property. People might have the piece of paper, they might have the deed, but they do not own property. Mother Nature owns property. and you just talk to people in Christchurch, lost their whole thing. And I was having a chat with someone about Auckland. Man, you guys are sitting on volcanoes up here. Like, I think straight away that's not the right way to frame it. And I mean, I guess in a legal sense you do own it, but certainly property is transient. Whereas Bitcoin, 12 words memorized, don't memorize, write it down somewhere safe. But the worst case, you can just memorize it. That's your wealth. There's something about that which for me was incredibly profound, and it changes the very logic of the way you think about wealth.
Yeah.
Because you can't divvy up a house and do it in small fractions. You can't do any of that stuff. You can't use your house to pay for stuff, really. I mean, you can get equity out on it, but you can't use it to buy a coffee. Whereas with Bitcoin, you can do that stuff. So it acts like a store of value, like a house does, but it's also able to be used as money just for day-to-day stuff. And so there's something about that which I think maybe people are still in the 20th century and they're like in this physical reality of houses. And again, you don't own it. They could rot away, they leaky homes, all of that stuff. And I'm just like, man, like, why would you muck around with that? Just get the next thing, which is Bitcoin,
Getting in the KiwiSaver fund that suits you and your situation is key to making sure you're maximizing your investment. Generate are an award-winning KiwiSaver provider with a track record of long-term performance, and they can help you do exactly this. Their advisors can meet with you to talk about all your options when it comes to KiwiSaver to help you decide what's best for you. Too many people never get KiwiSaver advice, but not you. Go to generatekiwisaver.co.nz/change to book a no-obligation chat with a Generate advisor. A copy of the product disclosure statement is available at generatekiwisaver.co.nz. The issuer of the scheme is Generate Investment Management Limited, and of course, past performance does not guarantee future returns. So you believe it's Bitcoin, but a lot of people would, and I see you defending this online sometimes, would tell you that it's a scam, a Ponzi, or whatever the terminology. So how do you, to have so much conviction that Bitcoin is the thing, how does it make you feel when you see the other side of the argument? And I guess part of the argument could be, and this is probably part two to that, is that because in New Zealand we know something's broken because house prices keep increasing, they don't really change. Like I saw one yesterday in Auckland, it's 1.2 million, absolute shithole inside. I'm like, fuck me. Is that what it looks like to own a $1.2 million property in Auckland? And it's like, anyway. But we know that something's broken, but we're so brought into it because we have to be, because once we take a stake in it, we want to see it increase because it's what we learn to increase in wealth. So if we didn't have this problem in New Zealand where house prices were increasing and basically they were flat like they were in Japan, do you think that you would be looking for and have as much conviction about Bitcoin being a solution?
Well, I think, that scenario, that's not reality, and so it's kind of hard to imagine it. But yeah, in that situation, maybe we would be looking at a different economic configuration. But the reality is, in most Western countries, like housing is the thing, and it's a real symptom.
What do you mean by that?
It's the thing that people are focusing on, whether it's Canada, Australia, New Zealand. There's this, like, people YOLOing into it. And again, when you go into the history and you look at the history of bubbles and talk about scams, like housing is a scam. The 1997 Asian financial crisis was driven by property speculation. The 1989 Japanese real estate bubble, again, property speculation. There's this long history of this like YOLOing into housing because it's kind of like as good as gold in a sense. Like it's something physical and tangible, but it's not gold. It's just this thing that can have artificial demand and scarcity put on it. And so for me, it's sort of a symptom of these cycles. And coming back to what you said before about, people know something's wrong. Yes, people know something's wrong and they feel it in their gut when they go and get whatever $7 jugs of milk and stuff. Like they go to grocery shopping and think, why are things so expensive? There's all of these issues. Why is healthcare such a sham? I honestly, man, one of the reasons we left New Zealand this time around was because we can't go to hospitals here. We can't see doctors here. It's just like, what has happened to New Zealand? And I think when you boil down a lot of these different issues, you realize money is at the root of it. And that is the nature of money. And they've done all of this stuff where they've printed all this money, they've created all this inflation, they've misaligned the incentives, that the system is starting to the wheels are starting to fall off. And people don't maybe have the education or the experience to see that there is a deeper issue. And so they're looking at the symptoms. We need more money for hospitals, we need to break up the duopoly on the supermarkets. It's like, no, it goes much deeper than that. And I think that's kind of part of the challenge and part of the education that I'm trying to do on my show is sort of like share this perspective that there is other ways of looking at these problems.
Yeah. I would, just to defend those who work in health, because I know some do listen to the pod, I haven't found an issue getting to a doctor if I've needed to. I haven't really too often, but over the last 5 years, I've been surprised at the access. However, I've then spoken to people to find out like that narrative around healthcare in New Zealand, what's going on, and definitely there's some deep-rooted problems in it, and especially in the regions, and even in towns like Waipakarau and Dannevirke and whatnot. Like if you can't attract doctors to that environment, then a lot of those things are becoming like teleconferences and stuff where people don't want to do that. But yeah.
Well, I mean, my mum works in healthcare and that, and I fully understand these frontline people are working hard, for what they do. But what I'm saying is it's a systematic issue, in my opinion. When last time I had to go to A&E, man, that was like an ordeal. Yeah. And to even get doctor, I think in Lower Hutt, to get like a GP registration, it's like incredibly difficult because they just all fill up. So, I mean, certainly that's compared to, say, my experience in other parts of the world. Yeah, interesting. Where you can just walk in and maybe it's more user pays and just some questions there, but certainly it's a different experience. And so that stood out to me. It's like, how did we get to this point?
I think the beauty of travel and actually just talking to other people is that, and like you kind of, I think that the internet has done this where it's given us access to different ways of thinking that we might not have had previously. But I was sat with an older gentleman recently, very, very successful in their life and done a lot of shit and still very in tune with what's going on out there. And they're sharing this story with me about how they were overseeing some assets for a family. And basically the Christchurch earthquake happened and one building in their property portfolio lost 2/3 of its value overnight. Now, on paper, before the earthquake, it was worth tens and tens and tens of millions. Earthquake happens. Banks say, we can't lend on that. Here's what we now see the value to be. We're going to need you to pay that money back. And even one story like that, you're like, wow, like you say, Mother Nature owns, property. And I think the thing is, once we buy property or whatever it is, right, then naturally we're going to defend it. You're going to defend Bitcoin. People are going to defend property. They're going to go off in the comments around how, it's not a scam. Who the fuck is this guy? Blah, blah, blah. Because normally, I don't know what the bias is or whatever, but we're trying to confirm the thing that we've done, right? But even that story, I was like, wow, that's pretty scary when the value is truly on paper. The bank then say, hey, it doesn't have that value anymore. You need to give the money back. Like, how do you give it back?
Yeah.
And admittedly in that story, the bank were very good and gave them 2 years to exit that deal. But I said, how common was that? And I said, that was very common after the Christchurch earthquake.
Yeah. I mean, look, on that point, my whole thing, and people, if they check out the show, they'll see, but I'm really into like Socratic dialogue and asking questions because certainly, I mean, and we can talk about this, I don't know if like Bitcoin is the long-term thing that actually is, 100% certain, right? It's certainly, for me, the best thing I've come across so far, but there still is challenges. And what we need to do is look at these things with a very open mind and look at it from different perspectives. And I sometimes wonder whether my background as a creative person has been useful for that because I'm trying to stay away from dogma. I don't want to just be saying, yeah, this is it. But so far, that's what I'm seeing. But yeah, I mean, if we take the property lens, up until now, that's been a really good idea. It's worked. And, the model has played out. And if you bought a house in 1980 in Ponsonby for $10,000 or whatever, you're doing pretty well. But that's a certain generation of people. And now if you're a young person, we've still got maybe these like infill townhouses that they're building. There's still a chance to maybe get a house. But I just see that getting more and more difficult and what you get for what you pay. Like last night, I love walking and I did this big walk from Sylvia Park to Pakuranga. It took about 2 hours just walking through and feeling like what the city means. Because Auckland's a city of cars, right? But to walk it, it's like, okay, you've got these big old villas and then you've got these tiny like paper-thin townhouses. They're not the same thing. They're like a cheap imitation. And I think of it a bit like shrinkflation where, the Mars bar gets like half as big over time, but you're still paying the same price. It's like that. You've got these cheap townhouses. They're building 6 on a block, 6 on a property space. And it's like, man, at what point do we just start living in the capsules? Like it's sort of like...
Well, you're kind of seeing that because people are moving to not townhouses, the like mini homes, and it's become
containers.
It's become a big industry.
And I think that's again like people like realize once upon a time you could buy like a quarter acre beautiful Cody timber house that was just a nice thing, and now they're living in these boxes, and then eventually maybe you end up with high rises and stuff like that, but it's still like there's no limit to how many houses you can build. It's an artificial limit, and the government and the regulators will just sort of like let that play out as they see fit. But again, it's totally artificially done. Whereas something like Bitcoin, which is mathematically scarce, you can't print more of it, no matter what the government of the day thinks is appropriate. There's something powerful about that idea, which, if you really sit with it, we've never had anything like this in the history of humankind. Yeah. Actual provable scarcity, because even with gold, maybe they find an asteroid, or they find, if the price of gold goes high enough, they dig into the center of the earth and get more. But no matter how hard you try, you can't get more Bitcoin than there are. There's only ever going to be 21 million. And there's just something about that which, for me, is the beginning of something quite revolutionary, I think.
Nice. We'll get into Bitcoin in a second. We'll just stick with property for a second. I think the other argument that I see online is like, but you can't live in your Bitcoin and you can't live in the S&P 500. So what do you say about that?
Yeah, well, I think, again, definitions are important, and the S&P and the equities market, stock market, it is investment. It is speculative. And that is not the same as savings. And so the way I think about Bitcoin is it is savings. Just like, once upon a time, you could just put money in the bank and it would do okay. You can't do that anymore. Why? Because the money is broken. And so, not being able to, I can't live in my Bitcoins, which is something people have said to me. It's like, well, no, you don't. And you don't, again, you don't live in the S&P 500 either, or you don't live in your, in an ETF. But you can purchase a home if you really want to with that savings. And I think that's the big difference here, is it's a much better way to save your money, because if you just have straight New Zealand dollars, which are savings as well, you're losing 8 to 10% based on the real inflation rate, which isn't really reflected by the CPI, which is again why you're paying hundreds of dollars at the supermarket for groceries, right? So it's savings. Yeah.
Final thing on property that I think that I've seen that I don't think a lot of people think about. Now, my mum I've lost my stepdad, so mum lives on her own. And I was back there recently, and she's like, can you please get up and clean the gutters? Now, part of me is like, fuck, I better not fall off this, because this is going to be a massive...
ACC.
This is going to be a big issue. But anyway, I get up and I help her clean the gutters. But I do that, and I think about it. I think, man, how many people across the country are going to have what they've been told is an asset, which truly, in accounting terms, if I'm putting my next advisory hat on, is a liability, because it's still costing you money, even once it's mortgage-free. So mum's mortgage-free, but she's still got rates, and she's frustrated by the cost of those, and you got to repair it. And a lot of people have the bulk of their wealth tied up in their property. Now, what do you do when the roof is cooked? It's 30 grand. Or the neighbour comes and says, hey, we need to sort this fence. You're up for half. I need 5 to 8 grand, or whatever. Like, how does someone access that cash? And I think it's just like younger people need to realize that we're living through this. So there's not really the answers, because people aren't talking about that, because we're now seeing it at scale with so many mortgage-free baby boomers getting to the point where they've lived through this methodology, which is basically on the ladder fast and then go again if you can build up enough equity and get a rental, and then at least someone else is paying that, and then you might have some passive income, but you might have one rental, or 600 grand median rent, 30 grand for the year. Okay, like how far does that go? By the time you pay 30% tax on it, or let's say even 20, you still got to pay your rates, your insurance, you still got to repair something. 2 weeks it's empty. All of a sudden that 30 grand of rent becomes, 20, let's say, maybe even less after tax, 15 grand. What's that per week? Does it add that much to your life? So even that teaching doesn't feel like it is that fit for purpose for the age that we now live in.
Yeah.
But again, the wealth is still tied up. So then people are then incentivized again to then go back to the bank and say, hey, now I need to borrow this. Now we might need a reverse mortgage. We might need an equity release scheme. We might have to sell the property to a family member and access it. So I think there's not been enough teaching that, hey, yes, it might protect your wealth, but it's stuck. And now what are you going to do? Like, why are we not waking Kiwi people up being like, hey, it might solve the wealth protection piece, but you're still fucking broke.
Yeah.
Like, you've got no access to the cash unless the bank will let you have the wealth.
Yeah. And along those lines as well, I mean, the process of selling a house actually is an incredibly painful, traumatic experience. And you've got all these agents' fees, and it can, a family member trying to sell a house at the moment, and, the market can go up and down. And it's like, man, why would you have such an illiquid thing with all your wealth stored in it like that if you really, do need to pull out to do something, right? And what you said with the maintenance, New Zealand is a country of these petty bourgeoisie, landlords who are trying to, look after and do things on the house. And maybe the housing stock is like from the 70s and it needs new gutters or whatever. Man, that's a mission. And again, it's like there's no real economic, it's not like it's a farm or a commercial, commercial real estate would be a different thing. But there's just houses, and you got the landlord up there on the roof and stuff. And it's like, man, what is that? Because if I contrast that with, say, Japan or Europe or other places where you have, corporations that own these houses, they're doing all of that for you. It's just like a much more professionalized system. And I think New Zealanders have that in their DNA, though, that they love the DIY and kind of the sense of ownership. But it is a mess. And you don't know, again, a house isn't necessarily a house either, because maybe you've got a leaky home, or you've got a property that's got some seismic issues. It's on some bad land, etc. Man, there's so much work that you got to do to just even understand, like, is this house going to wash away in the next flood, and stuff like that. So for me, it's just so much overhead. Whereas when you have something that's purely designed as money, as savings from the get-go, like Bitcoin, it's just a much easier thing. You don't have to think about it. You don't stay up at night thinking, oh man, what am I going to do about those foundations? It just works.
So is your earning income at the moment, and we'll touch on that in a second, but basically you're stacking your savings directly into Bitcoin, like that's your methodology?
I think of it like a battery, and I think of it like charging a battery. And so I like to put as much as I can into Bitcoin. I like to be available, and I like to have exposure there to ride the wave, because as we've seen, it is pretty volatile. And that can be really good when you're exposed to it, because you can be riding the wave and you go all the way up. You go a little bit down, but generally the trend is, Bitcoin is increasing in purchasing power over time. And so, I try to save what's called DCA, dollar cost average. Like many people would do the similar things for their share portfolio. I do that with Bitcoin. And there's some really good ways to do that. It's not really too much effort to plan that out, and you just fire and forget, and it works.
Yeah, nice one. Okay, so what is it that you're doing in Japan now? Because we've kind of skipped over that bit.
Yeah.
What do you do? The podcast, the transformation of value, right, is a hobby, or that's part of your income earning ability? Like, what do you do to make some cash to then buy some Bitcoin?
Yeah, I'm probably a bit like you, Luke. I use the podcast as a funnel for people to connect with me. So, I mean, it's pretty niche. People beginning to ask these questions. It's not everyone, but certainly people are beginning to ask these questions. They come across the show. We get in touch. Just this trip through to New Zealand, I've been able to meet with a lot of the listeners of the show. And what I've found, there's some real common traits. The people who listen to the show are generally pretty driven people. They're either business owners or they're pretty successful in their careers. They know there's something wrong with the way money is working. And they're still interested in building stuff, though. And so I've had some real success doing consulting, and so I do a lot of business strategy, and that's where my creative mind comes in. I used to work in tech in Japan, and I've still got that kind of interest in building businesses and doing stuff. So I work with a couple of companies, I've got an agri-tech company I work with, which is really incredible, working on like sustainable farming, stuff like that, and just kind of giving them new perspectives on how they do things. And so I'm able to do that remotely. Travel to meet people, but effectively it is kind of like bringing some of the themes, not so much always the Bitcoin stuff, but more even just looking at problems and kind of understanding problems, bringing that to clients and helping them talk that through is what I do at the moment.
Okay, so you're effectively doing consulting back into New Zealand.
Globally.
Oh, globally. Okay, gotcha. But you're based in Japan. You love Japan.
Yeah. And my wife's Japanese, and we've got an interesting situation where it's also just a little bit cheaper than New Zealand. So it's still very high quality, whether it's food or housing or whatever. And I say to people, what I used to pay for my flat in Wellington which is a bit of a mess. We get a really nice place in Japan, and it's not dirt cheap. Don't get me wrong, but it's just they haven't quite experienced the same issues we have here with money printing, especially over the COVID years. So it's just a nice place to live. It's very safe, and a lot of people come through, so I'm able to meet with a lot of people. It's really good for my business. Yeah.
It's interesting, because when I was back in Palmy, I went past 2 of my old flats that I lived in.
Oh yeah,
and I paid market rate to live there, but you'd have 4 or 5 guys like living in a house, and I think it's that this is very different. But I do think sometimes the country gets outraged about how we might treat people moving to New Zealand and how we make them live. And then I'm like, have you been to a university city? Like, do you know what students do?
Yeah.
Have you been to Dunedin and have a look? But anyway, 2 of those places have been bowled. And basically one of them's just empty bare land now, which again kind of reminds us property can, like, does it really have the value that we think that it does? But then secondly, to then counter that and go, yes, it does. The first place that's been bowled, there's now probably 6 units on that piece of land. And I think, oh shit, we used to joke about it when we lived there. I wonder if this place would get condemned one day.
Yeah.
And now it's like, okay, there's 6 people living in nice units, but the value is the land, right? Which then they pop up 3 units facing each other.
Yeah. Well, on that note, there's something more pernicious about all of this, which is that when, I got friends in Wellington, and these are like professional people, and they've been flatting for like 10, 20 years basically, because Wellington's probably more cooked than Auckland. And I'm like, guys, there's something about flatting where it's like, man, it's pretty hard to have a family or like be in long-term relationships and stuff. And there's this like long-term social impact where, man, like people who are in this younger generation, it's like, man, how do you think about having kids when you've got like 3 flatmates? How do you think about, settling down when you're still, sharing the kitchen with some people? Like, there's something really wrong about that. And that's actually like a real disservice to New Zealanders. And I think longer term, we're beginning to see the brain drain. But I think just on a social level, like, what does that do for like families and communities? I think it's pretty dangerous,
But in other countries, it's very common to live together as a family unit across generations. So you're talking about like, but I know what you mean. I've had flatmates where it's like, oh shit, I can't use the kitchen now because of that.
Yeah,
or
flatmates aren't family, man. Like, I mean, I think it's actually pretty awesome to have like grandparents in the same house, for example, if you've got a big enough place. But to have like some dudes, right? Like with students again, like you can't have a family like that. And I think that's broken. And again, it's artificially created scarcity, and it's broken money that's leading to this. And people like stuck in their rooms and playing video games or something. Like, man, like we just got to think about that a bit more, I think.
Okay, so you say money is broken.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
So the way money, New Zealand pioneered this in a sense. The idea of 1 to 3% inflation targeting, originally 2% targeting, came out of New Zealand. And that was Roger Douglas and Don Brash put that together, And so effectively our money is engineered at the very least to lose 1 to 3% of its value every year.
And compound.
And it compounds. And actually, prior to that, it's been a lot more. And we've seen that also subsequently, it's been a lot more. The money is designed to lose its value. And this is based on the false premises of Keynesian economics, which is that, well, you need to have inflation, otherwise people won't spend. And this, unfortunately, has led to a lot of the issues we've seen over the last, I would say, 100 years almost, is that people are not able to save. They're not able to put capital away to invest in businesses and things like that because it's going to melt away. They're incentivized to spend it now. And this is why I just saw an article the other day on how, I think it's DoorDash is offering like financing options for like delivery food.
Yeah, I saw someone was buying a burrito over 6 payments as well.
Yeah. And like Afterpay in New Zealand, for example, these kinds of things. It's what it is it's a shorter and shorter time preference. And so you're focusing on the now. And we see this through society, whether it's TikTok or just our attention spans are getting shorter and shorter. You can't build for the future anymore because you don't even know like what the inflation rate will be in 2 years. And at a high level, infrastructure projects, like why is it that New Zealand can't get infrastructure right? I would say a lot of it is because it's hard for these companies to plan multi-year projects because of inflation. And that also applies to individuals. How do you plan your life if you don't know what the value of money is going to be in 3 years? So there's, as I said, it was broken, and everything that spawns from that is also broken.
Yeah. So inflation is the thing that's causing it to be broken as such?
Yeah.
Like to put it simply?
Yeah.
So just, I did some slides for a presentation recently, and I looked at the 10 grand So $10,000 general CPI through the RBNZ, Reserve Bank of New Zealand's inflation calculator. In 7 years, 3.6 is the compounded average annual rate of inflation. So it's outside of the 1 to 3, which is a 21.8% change in purchasing power. So $10,000 worth of stuff in 2017, quarter four, would be $12,793.24 in quarter four. And we could probably argue that the basket of goods is probably bullshit in terms of a metric anyway, because we all have an individual rate of inflation. But even then, I went, okay, what does it look like over a quarter of a decade? Because I think people are getting excited that inflation is coming back down the other side. And it's like, okay, it's not a problem anymore, but we have to remember it compounds. So general CPI that cost $10,000 in 1999, quarter four, would cost $18,852.78. So in 25 years, the average compound rate is 2.6%, which is basically at the top of that 1 to 3%, target. So money's been losing its value, and it's a 47% change in purchasing power. So we've lost in 25 years 47% of our purchasing power.
It's just cut in half, man.
Yeah.
And if you imagine, though, in an alternative reality, if you could just put that 10 grand away and it held its purchasing power through all those years, or maybe it didn't even just hold it, it increased its purchasing power. I think that's what we're looking at with Bitcoin. And over time, if you hold for a reasonable, the midterm, it increases its purchasing power as it monetizes into the world's reserve currency. And it's just incredible. And again, it's such a paradigm shift. It's not a low-level thing. This is like a major change, similar to something like the internet or the printing press or one of these other major historical technologies. And that is there's a reason people they can't stop talking about Bitcoin once they understand it. It's like, this is the technology change. And when you point the numbers out like that, because that takes 25 years, people kind of forget, they have short memory spans and they don't realize, I remember, I don't know about you, bro, but my first job working, I was at warehouse stationery, I was getting like $8 an hour. Now, what's the minimum wage? It's like $23, $24, something like that. So it's like I was busting myself, an hour, I was getting $8 and that is now only worth, it's like, and that minimum wage has maybe gone up more, but it's just like incredible to me that you're selling your time like that, and then you're losing the value that you were trying to save at the time. It's crazy. And again, that's broken money for you.
Yeah. And the sad thing is that even if Bitcoin isn't the solution, or maybe we're overplaying how dangerous this is and how bad it is and just suck it up and get on with it, a lot of people would never try to understand this. So I can see why they get frustrated when everything just, they'll then notice it in their day-to-day life. Like, why is this so expensive? And why can't I afford this? And then instead of trying to understand it, like I did a 2.5-hour debate that I watched the other day around inequality, and they didn't once talk about central banks or money creation. And I thought that's fascinating because to me, like that's a big part of the conversation and the debate, but it didn't come up at all.
Well, that's the other thing. Language is important here, and I have a bit of a bone to pick with the Reserve Bank of New Zealand because they call themselves Te Putea Matua, and they use this imagery of like the great kauri trees and stuff. And I'm like, man, this is a crock. Like, you guys are printing this money, you're engineering recessions, you call yourself like, that you're trying to be like conscious to, all New Zealanders, but they're actually the ones who are orchestrating all of this stuff, and they're sort of high and mighty in Wellington. And I don't want to make this, about individuals, but the institution itself is, by definition, what it's doing is it's mucking with the money. And every time they come out to announce their OCR changes and stuff, people are like on the edge of their seat. And it's like, when did we give them this much power? I think it should be totally decoupled from the state. It shouldn't have someone controlling it. It should be a free market for money, and something like Bitcoin, which is the separation of money and state. That is what it needs to be. Because without that, I think we're just going to see more and more of these economic crises. And the moment there's any kind of economic crisis, they'll come in with quantitative easing, and I think it's just going to cause more and more inflation.
Okay, so you say they'll come in with more quantitative easing, which probably people would be more familiar with money printing. Calling it that. So, So they're just going to create more debt basically, right? Yeah. Okay. So then what does one need to be mindful of when that happens next time, if you're confident that it happens again?
So I think if we go back to say something like 2008 in the GFC, the great financial crisis, that was a pretty major event, and they had to do quantitative easing, in the States in particular to respond to that. Then we saw something like COVID, and it's like, well, did we really need to print money for that? And I think what, unfortunately, we might see in the coming years is that any sense of an emergency, anything that could be spun into an emergency, will be a great excuse for printing money. And whereas once upon a time it was used maybe more sparingly, as this process accelerates, they will have to have excuses, and you'll see the propaganda machine start to spin up, whether it's related to climate stuff or global trade or geopolitical stuff.
Even I think in New Zealand, the narrative is that we have a very low debt to GDP. So it's basically getting people primed that, hey, get ready, like we will put more debt in. But you can't have debt without somebody owing it back. So then,
Well, and what they'll do, this is the history of propaganda, but they will telegraph it. They always do. And I think you start to look at the language and that they're starting to put out there. I think they are slowly starting to prime things. And again, the world is changing as well. You've got geopolitical fragmentation, a decentralization, I guess, of power. And I don't have a crystal ball, but I certainly think we're going to see that just shake up the snow globe. And money printing, of course, is going to happen.
It's interesting, right at the start of COVID, and I've mentioned this a number of times on the pod, but I think it'll stick with me for the rest of my life. But I was at my parents' for dinner, and we were talking about how now there was about another $10,000 of debt in the country for every single person. And I was trying to explain to them, I'm like, this is a big fucking deal, man. This is a big problem. Like, this is not going to wash out great. And I remember them walking to my car, and they're just kind of like, hey, mate, like, just calm down a bit, eh? Like, it's not.
It's okay.
And I'm like, no, this is bad. Like, this isn't good. Like, this, and I could kind of see from what I had learned that this is going to lead to a lot of shit, in terms of inflation, asset prices, people leaving, and hopefully, I hope we have some regression to the mean and things settle down. But my very simple brain is like, oh, you can't add that much debt into a system and then not have some consequences. Like, a good way for people to think about this, if the government just said tomorrow, well, maybe Westpac do, right? Westpac just go to everybody tomorrow, hey, we've got, through open banking now, we have all of your bank accounts. We've just put 10 grand in every one, and do what you want with it. Like, I can probably guess where that money is going to end up and what's going to happen, and think about how frothy that would be. And then, by the way, like, it does need to be paid at some stage. It does need to be repaid back. So the money's still owed somewhere, but let's just do it as an experiment. Everyone gets 10 grand.
Yeah.
Like, that's basically the way I looked at it. I'm like, holy shit, this is, and then I walk past barbers that aren't open, but those people are getting paid and getting a subsidy. Someone's paying their wage, but I'm working in my apartment and I'm not taking any subsidy, and I'm going, that's strange. They're getting paid in their home and they're not in their employment, and I'm still doing what I'm normally doing, but I'm not. So I started piecing these things together. I'm like, shit.
Well, to add to that, Luke, something else that I think beyond the Bitcoin stuff we really need to be aware of is the development of CBDCs. Is this something you're familiar with?
I don't know heaps about it, but
central bank digital currencies, and this is something the Reserve Bank of New Zealand is working on. They're calling it digital cash, and I think it's very concerning because what you just said, being able to inject money at a retail level into people's accounts, that is a two-way street though, because it means they can also take money out, they can turn money off, and I think it's kind of a meme at this point. But the whole carbon credit thing, and maybe. You've brought too much petrol this week, so we're going to just be freezing your ability to buy petrol. Stuff like that is possible when you have programmable money that is run by the state. And I think this is something we really need to look into. It's not really getting any airtime in the media. I've tried talking about it, but we have to be really careful because no one even uses cash anymore. FPOS still goes through the commercial banks, but when you have a system where the state can actually see every transaction, it can monitor it, it can run analytics on it, and it can say, hey, I don't actually like what Cody and Luke are talking about. We're going to just go and demonetize them and punish them. We're going to do some mucking around with the money, which is the kind of stuff you see in totalitarian states. I think this is something we have to be really careful of. And it's unfortunate, though, because that's the only place we can go, is to have things like that, to have negative interest rates, to have all of these kind of extra limits on what we can do with our money. It's the only way that fiat money can go. And so I see that as sort of the path of slavery, whereas something like Bitcoin, which is permissionless, you can't control it, that's the path of freedom. So it's kind of a little bit more, I guess, a philosophical question, but there's almost these two paths that are starting to open up.
So you believe that CBDC will basically will end up there eventually? It seems like we're on that path.
It has to. The control mechanism, if it's there, it will be used.
Yeah.
And if they can turn off the money for things that they don't like, they will do that.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, from what I've read, it seems like it's inevitable that in our lifetime we will see a CBDC. And no matter what people think in New Zealand, it's happening regardless, is the take that I get on it. Even though I saw thousands of people did submissions about it.
They were most of them were negative.
Yeah,
They're like,
really?
don't do this, bro. And they were still going to do it. And that's also because the Reserve Bank is unelected. So you don't get to vote for that. And they're arguably the most powerful institution in the country. And they got 600 people over there on the terrace in Wellington. And I'm like, man, what are you guys doing? Your job was to control inflation, and now you're giving us a totalitarian state. Like, I don't know if I signed up for that.
I think their argument would be that obviously there's a lot of positives to it, which people can go and look at. But one thing that I heard was like it's programmable to the point that they could then program the interest rate. So basically...
And go negative, yeah.
Well, yeah.
Take the money out, yeah.
But why does everybody have the same interest rate when it could then be, people around in different parts of the country based on how the economy is going? It could be then... debt could be more expensive or less expensive in different regions. But I think my brain always goes to, like technology advances, it's for the positive. But Mikey always reminds me, like, you're an idiot, mate. it can be used against you. I'm like, okay.
Yeah, if people can take anything away from this conversation, it's like, I'm here to ask questions, and I've looked into this, and the history of fiat money and government money is a history of abuses of trust. And I certainly don't trust the Reserve Bank or any institution run by the government to look after this stuff. They can barely get inflation right. And so it's like, we got to just be really careful and vigilant. And people don't even know that this is an institution, that this is even a thing. And I think it's by purpose that they're trying to conceal this rollout of the CBDC.
I know that this is probably an hour topic on its own, but for the everyday person, from the research that you've done and the learning that you've done, what is Bitcoin?
Bitcoin, I mean, at its base is peer-to-peer digital cash that removes the need for trusted third parties. And it is a money that has a programmable, mathematical scarcity. You can't make more of it. It just is what it is. And we just have to work with that. And so, it came out 2008. It's been in operation for 16 years now. And in that time, it's gone from being this niche thing on some internet forum to being one of the world's most valuable assets. It's talked about by presidents and kings globally. It's been an incredible story, and for me, it really represents freedom at its deepest, yes.
How do you get comfortable investing into the volatility?
I think if you think about it in terms of 3, 4, 5 year periods of holding at the very least, it basically means you're never going to go below. If you approach it with like a 4 year holding pattern, you're not really going to go underwater. And if you look at the history of it, it sort of goes through these peaks, a little bit of a drawback, and then it goes to another peak. And so, over the short term, like if you're holding for a year, you should expect volatility. But I think over 3, 4, 5 years, it will preserve your value.
I saw over the weekend, and I've been talking about this recently a little bit, but basically. People borrowing to buy stocks. Now, the belief is that you can pay the interest cost on the debt, and then you are going to invest into, an ETF, and that becomes worth more. That's tax-free. But it's basically, if money wasn't broken, we probably wouldn't even think to do that, right? So we're taking debt on because we know that money loses its value to try and beat inflation and beat the race by then investing at scale and at leverage with money that's not really ours and we owe to somebody in the hope that we can get a better return than inflation and the tax and the interest that we have to pay. Now, I see people doing that with Bitcoin as well, where it's like, okay, should I borrow to buy Bitcoin? And obviously there's a lot of risk in doing that. There's a lot of risk in anything as soon as you take debt. But it's almost like I look at it and go, if money wasn't so, like losing its value so quickly, would people even think to do stuff like that? Yeah.
So, look, man, I'm a simple guy. Stay humble, stack sats. Sats being the subunit of Bitcoin. I I don't know if borrowing is the right thing for me. I don't know if I can recommend it to people. I'm not a financial advisor. I think it can be dangerous. If you know what you're doing and you've studied Bitcoin, sure, maybe people have an edge and they've got a plan. But I think the simplest thing is to just live within your means.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, why I want to bring that up is because then I saw someone talking about how you have to be very careful investing into the S&P 500 with debt, because they had 9 months of it going well and 3 months of it going poorly. So they pulled it all out and went back to property.
Yeah.
I'm like, dude, like, you probably don't want to do that over a 1 year period.
You've got to have a long-term time frame. And this, coming back to the social issues that I mentioned earlier, people aren't able to think in decades now.
No.
They're thinking in like quarters, if at the most. And that's problematic, because how do you build a valuable business over like a quarter? You have to have a long-term outlook. And so there's all of these like meta issues as well around time preference that, yeah, everyone's in it for a quick win. And that arguably is something I want to also make clear is, for me, it's Bitcoin and Bitcoin only. Other cryptocurrencies, other meme coins, everything else is a scam like that, because they're trying to like get in and then get out when the value goes up. Bitcoin's the only one where, yeah, you're riding the thing for a decade.
Yeah.
And that's a big difference. And I feel like in that sense, the stock market and all of these other cryptos are basically a casino. And people are just trying to get lucky, you know?
Yeah. So you believe ultimately that you're swapping your dollars that you make, no matter what country you earn them from, and swapping them for Bitcoin, which will continue to stay scarce. And yes, you'll have volatility in the meantime, but you can have a peace of mind that your what you've earned, your work that you've done, is going to maintain its value in the future.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And more than that, New Zealand does have, a history of a stable government. However, I've got plenty of friends, man, who are in countries that have gone completely to zero. And I don't actually know if New Zealand has the goods to avoid that fate. We're not a rich country, man. Australia is a wealthy country. New Zealand is not a wealthy country. And so what does it take? Is it the collapse of global milk prices or something, some black swan that means the New Zealand dollar?
Yeah.
And it's like, man, I can have Bitcoin. It's global. It's mathematical. It's a much better way to store your value, in my opinion.
Yeah, well, I went to Vegas recently, and
The casinos.
oh, that's a place that will just tear you apart. But it just teaches you as well when you transfer your New Zealand dollars to American dollars. Like, I withdrew 300 US out of a ATM in a casino. It was 613 New Zealand dollars. So, $100 play around on a blackjack table or a roulette, a couple of spins, 3 spins or whatever it's like, there's, you're losing 2 for 1. And those casinos aren't designed for you to win. So you know what you're getting yourself into. But even just purchasing anything, and I can see why so many people are obsessed by trying to make the US, well, not obsessed, but, they focus on, okay, the solution is to make US dollars because that's probably a stronger dollar. But even they are printing a shitload of money, right, and devaluing their currency.
And arguably, there is a theory that the development of the New Zealand CBDC, in a sense, is that the Reserve Bank has run the numbers and they see the threat of synthetic US dollars like stable coins and things like PayPal and that, where, man, as a Kiwi business owner, yeah, you should be earning US dollars, because the New Zealand dollar is, if I can say it, it's a shitcoin. And I think that is all currencies, and the US dollar just happens to be the strongest one out of all of the fiat currencies. But even then, it's getting printed. And unfortunately, if we're earning US dollars, we don't get any of the benefits of their money printing, because they print money, they build roads in the US and stuff, whatever they're doing, their wars and stuff. But like, we don't get any of that in New Zealand. So it's like, no one wins in that sense.
All right, final question, mate. Re all of this, and we'll finish up with a couple of little tidbits. But what are you going to do if all of this is just a giant bubble, like you mentioned bubbles earlier, and it all goes to zero eventually, and it was like a phase in time, crazy time of history, and you couldn't see that, and everybody that thinks it's a scam, etc., is right?
And if something like that happens, I think it's going to be really important that we understand why it happened. I think it's pretty unlikely. Bitcoin, I'll be buying it all the way down. And there'll be others out there who will keep. I'm pretty sure there's a price floor at this point.
Yeah.
But if there's some issue, some unknown bug, something that I haven't discovered in my thousands of hours of research, I think we will have to just learn from the mistake, because money's still broken. And if Bitcoin fails for whatever reason, which is unlikely, I think we're going to have to find another way to fix it.
Nice. You are a creative and I would say, intellectual. You use words like pernicious,
Oh, sorry.
petty bourgeoisie, Socratic conversations, and dogma. I don't know what the fuck any of those mean.
Okay, sorry.
But I enjoy that. But let's just look at one of them. What's a Socratic conversation?
It's just where you both ask questions with the intent of finding truth. So instead of just stating my opinion, you say something and I'll ask you, why do you think that is? And then you'll say something else and I'll say, oh, why is that? And eventually, ideally, we both together arrive at the answer.
Nice. Well, that's part of why I like doing this podcast, because you get to meet so many different people doing different things from walks of life, and they have different vocabs, they have different way of viewing things. So this has been fascinating. I want to remind people that myself nor you, and speaking on your behalf, and I'm sure you'll echo this, but we're not sitting here telling you to buy Bitcoin. This is a conversation with somebody who, from what I have picked up, you have been a run-of-the-mill sort of Kiwi lad. You've probably always asked questions. You're a creative sort of a person. You've had your eyes open going to Japan. You've noticed that something's not quite right with money, and then you start going down a research path as you probably then get more interested in it as well, put more hours into it to figure out what's actually going on here. Bitcoin becomes the solution, but that then just opens your eyes to all sorts of different things. Would that be a fair summary of sort of how you've got there?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. So then my final question would be, and you have a podcast called The Transformation of Value, where you have more of these in-depth conversations with people who are more probably interested in this space than a lot of the people that I speak to, right? What would you say your mission is? Like, why do you care about this?
So the podcast is really for me to understand what's going on, man. I'm there to learn, because if I'm wrong, I'd like to know if I'm wrong, and if there's other opportunities to do stuff, other things I can connect with, I would like to know. So for me, the podcast and this journey of learning is to really educate myself. And along the way, I've met so many incredible people and had so many conversations that have blown my mind that it's just, it's a bit of a lifelong learning experience, yeah.
Good on you. All right, mate. Well, how can people find you if they need to reach out or want to listen to your podcast? How do they do that?
Yeah, if people want to check me out, it's The Transformation of Value. You can find it on YouTube, Spotify, anywhere you listen to podcasts. And I'm also on Twitter and Instagram as Cody Ellingham. You can find me there, hit me up, send me your questions if you want to ask me something. Otherwise, I'm glad I could chat with you, Luke.
No worries. And LinkedIn as well. I see you popping
I'm
up
on
there,
LinkedIn every now and then, yeah.
I normally see you commenting, winding up somebody that says that.
At the Reserve Bank, maybe.
Good man. Well, it's been fascinating to sit down, and I'm sure that will have got a lot of people thinking. And I think people know deep down that something's broken with money, and it's very scary making the bet on what the solution is, whether it's Bitcoin, whether it's property, whether it's investing, whether it's leaving the country, whether it's, learning a skill to then barter with that, whether it's, trading, daily day trading, or whether it's, just risking everything and gambling it, or whether it's earning US dollars, etc. I think the reason that we're all looking for what these things are is because deep down we know this is fucked. I don't want to hear from mum again that on one income they bought a 46 bedroom house and the interest rate was dearer and you don't understand, and back in my day and stuff. We're like, I don't think that we're back in your day. I'm not sure. Something's not quite right here.
Yeah.
So it's good to see someone. How old are you, mate?
I'm 33.
33, nice. At that age, that's asking some of these questions and then willing to do the research, but also willing to back yourself in what you believe the solution is, and have so much conviction about this. Because I get questions all the time where you can tell people, no, something's not quite right, but it's like, what are your thoughts about this? But they're still not taking the action, because I think a lot of us are just shit scared of getting it wrong. Because if we're wrong, we're then even further back behind where we potentially could have been. So I can see why people do default to not thinking, not asking, and then blindly just DCAing every week into a mortgage.
Yeah.
All right, let's leave it there.
All right, man. Thank you so much.